everyone. Welcome to today's John Cain lunch. My name is Meredith Eldridge. I am the Director of Operations and Communications at Per Capita. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also to the traditional owners of the lands around Australia where our online viewers are joining from. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Wesa Chau. Wesa joined Per Capita as Executive Director in August this year. She holds a PhD in Political Science, a Master of Business Management, and Bachelor degrees in both Software Engineering and Commerce. Her previous work has spanned policy areas including gender, multicultural diversity, climate, disability, education, social innovation, and aged care. She has advised governments, corporations, and community organisations on inclusive policy and governance. Wesa has been inducted into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women and the Victorian Multicultural Honour Roll. She has also been named one of the 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians and honoured as Young Victorian of the Year. Please welcome Wesa Chau.
Thanks Meredith. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the land was never ceded and will always be Aboriginal land. So when people ask me what I've learnt over the 2 decades working in community advocacy and politics, I often say this: the most important skill in politics are rarely the ones we were formally taught. We can study policy, governance, economics or law, but none of that really prepares you for the moment that truly defines influence. The quiet negotiation that shifts an outcome, the conversation that builds trust after a conflict, the ability to read the room and sense when to speak and when to listen. It is not always the public presentation, and certainly not the social media posts. And these are all political skills. And yet they are often invisible, learned only through experience, mentorship, and trial and error. I didn't always understand that because I didn't come from a family of political activists. And so growing up, everyone around me was in business. And so at high school, I picked the elective subject, business and politics. Now, don't ask me why they put business and politics together. But I did chose that subject because of the business and not the politics. Even though I did get high marks for politics, suggesting that I might have an innate interest in the subject. But that didn't provoke me to join a political party at that point. At university, I studied engineering commerce. Like just any a good child of a migrant. And I wasn't really interested in politics or formal political party at all. I really didn't see myself in that world. But I did spend years fighting for international students and was really active in social clubs. And during that period, I and other friends established the Australian Federation of International Students and advocated for international student concerns at that point to local, state and federal governments. The apex was speaking in front of a packed room with 6 television cameras pointing at me at the launch of a funded international student service. I still have this really funny photo of a giant journalist, double my size, holding a microphone to me, like a really miniature me with a really giant journalist at that point. But that experience really helped me understand some of the positive outcomes that can be achieved through politics. And I remember saying at the launch that it takes years after you sow the seed, that you can pick the fruits. And to me, that's what politics is. I officially joined the Labor Party in 2004 and ran as a federal candidate in 2013. And at the time, I was the only candidate of Chinese background. But then Jason Yeson Lee, a good friend of mine, joined the team in New South Wales, but it was still a really rare sight of people of diverse background to run in politics. And as I was preparing for that campaign, I was really excited to learn campaigning skills, although during the campaign and throughout the campaign, I actually ended up learning more about messaging, how to frame topics, and how to relate my personal stories on various topics. And what I've also learned was that what worked in one group does not necessarily work in another. And this insight required me to have an in-depth understanding of myself and my values, and helped me realize that politics is more than just campaigning. The range of skills needed was much broader and much more complex. After that campaign, I grew really curious to learn about how to be an effective politician. I started observing other successful politicians that I admire. I researched their journeys and tried to understand how they've reached their positions. And then I started my PhD journey. So I was both researching, looking at the research that exists, observed politicians very closely, and also reflecting on my own experiences as well. I was really deeply curious as to why, for example, Julie Gillard, despite her apparent cold demeanour on TV or radio, was really warm, approachable, and funny when I met her in person. But when I reflected on my own experience as a candidate, I began to understand why. For example, I was interviewed by a journalist, and the prospect of being recorded would sometimes cause me to freeze. So I'd be left with nothing to say. Because I knew the media would, without fail, find the worst line and put that line on air. And then in 2016, I co-founded Poliversity, a partisan group that aims to increase cultural diversity within the ALP through awareness, conversations, and learning programs. And I have my co-founder here with me today, Jae Young Loh. Thanks for being on this journey with me. And at the so James just on that table. And I still remember all the conversations we've had with politicians, with party officials, with journalists and others in the party, the need for representation. Sometimes we're met with brick walls, others friendly chats with no actions, sometimes getting told off. And then there are those who did help, but they were in the minority at the time. And now fast forward to 2025, if we have a look at Parliament right now, while it has improved, it still doesn't reflect the community we see on the streets. And at Per Capita, we've been working on a report, The Way In, and we're looking into the demographics of federal parliamentarians. It shows that our parliament doesn't fully reflect the community, even though gender is much better, but that's primarily because of the Labor Party affirmative action rules. So there are many more women in parliament than we've ever had before, which is something we really should celebrate. Even though cultural diversity is improving, the ancestry of federal parliamentarians compared to the population is not yet representative. So Parliament is still only a narrow slice of what we see, a narrow slice of Australia. And that gap really matters. It matters because whose voices are present determines what's get heard, what's get funded, and what gets changed. It means that our representative politics is not representative. For many years, I've thought of ways to improve this picture. How do we practically get more culturally diverse people in Parliament? How do we move from recognising a gap to actually addressing it? I believe there are two sides to addressing this. First, there's the systemic barrier that makes it challenging for anyone from minority backgrounds to get in. And there are many things I can say about this. The network effects, the expectation of what a politician should look like, the implicit bias, the costs, who gets taken seriously, who gets mentored. But I'm not dedicating today's presentation talking about that, because a lot of other work has already been done, and we all know the stories about that. What I do want to talk about is the second side, the political skills. If we want to address the systemic barrier, we need more people with lived experience in Parliament to help change the system from within. But at the same time, the first group with lived experience who go in will face challenges. Their lived experience will give them insights and legitimacy, but it also exposes them to risks, to criticisms and the expectation that they must represent everyone. And so that means that people with lived experience by itself is not enough. You need the skills as well. I would also argue that skills is even more important for people of minority backgrounds than those from the majority group, because pioneers often carry more than their own hopes. They carry the hopes of many people. As remember, Julia Gillard said this about her experience of being the first woman Prime Minister. The reaction to being the first female Prime Minister does not explain everything about my Prime Ministership, nor does it explain nothing about my Prime Ministership. What I'm absolutely confident is it'll be easier for the next woman, and the woman after that, and the woman after that, and I'm really proud of that. What she's really saying is that for any pioneers, the system is not always kind to you, but yet you still need to be in there, you still need to show up, to persist, to demand that voice to be heard. Because each person who steps in transforms the space just so slightly, shifting the expectation and challenging that norm. And to do that, you really need to understand the rules of the space. You need to know the limits as to what you can push, where the red line is that you cannot cross, and you also need to navigate it delicately, but also with courage as well. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you offend other people, and sometimes people misunderstand you, and including those from your own community as well. Because the system is not built for you, so arguably you need higher political skills to create that change. And evidence show it. We all know that Julia Gillard achieved more legislative changes in her term in a minority government, but yet people don't always appreciate or recognise it. And as I did my research on political skills, I also put some of these skills to test. I wanted to see if they really truly work. And in doing so, I've experienced also cultural differences in how I was brought up and how and what I needed to do to have the impact in an Australian context. Now, on the testing side, I navigated the party. I didn't come from Young Labor, so the process of understanding how the national conference and the state conference took some time, where you've got hundreds of people having equal voting powers and how they actually work as well. And of course, there are factions that hold certain numbers. And the interesting thing from my observation is sometimes people talk about as if those numbers are fixed. But in my experience, they are fluid. It's a bit like mud. It moves and is murky. When I started to understand it, the influence became just a little bit easier. Not easy, but a little bit easier. And on the research side, my biggest challenge was the lack of definition of political skills, particularly in political science. So when I started this work, I asked people informally what they think political skills are, and found that people in politics intuitively know what it is and can say a lot about it. But no one can tell me what it truly is, meaning they can't really break it down into components and learnable parts. Those who observe politics or people who work in adjacent to politics, so we're talking about journalists, activists, or policymakers, often return me with the question, so what do you mean by political skills? Or they just assume it's the campaigning skills or just the skills to become a spin master. Now, that's a very narrow definition of political skills. So, first things first, definitions. This is what I found. So political skills are the skills to build trust, influence and persuade others to support a decision within a political context. Political skills are the skills to build trust, influence and persuade others to support a decision within a political context. So let's break this down. When I say to build trust, these are the social equity skills. Influence and persuade others are the communication skills. And to support a decision within a political context are the intellectual skills. These are the three categories of political skills in my typology. And the definition holds the essence of each of the categories. So first of all, intellectual skills. These are the skills to make decisions within a political context. And that includes strategic thinking, critical thinking, intellectual openness, and political judgment. And in having strategic thinking, you need to articulate a political goal. I remember early in my career, a more senior person asked me when I spoke to them about the need to have more cultural diversity. And so he asked me, when you say cultural diversity, what do you really mean? Is it a policy change? Is it a legislative change? Are you asking for a program? What is it really? And this question remained with me because what he meant was it's easier to support an idea or a value, but without the details in the ask, nothing will change. In that instance, I suddenly understood what politics is. It's not just a contest of ideas, it's a contest of resources. So this goal, whatever this goal is, whatever you want to change, is absolutely crucial. Because whatever the goal is determines how you actually engage with that system, who you need to speak to, where you can best influence it, what levers you can pull, and what constraints you might face. So when you ask for resources that reflect a value that you have, and when these resources are finite, strategic thinking is not simply a nice to have, but is actually quite critical. This is because all the systems differ quite a lot. And it influences, the kind of influence you might need in a local government, for example, is very different from federal parliament. And the expectations, the power dynamics, the formal rules, the informal rules, they all differ. So the strategic thinking must include the system you're in. So when we think about the system, it's also important to understand the democratic political context as well, because each system differs and it's also very different from the business context as well. So for example, there's no one person or small group of people, decision makers that you might actually see in a business setting. For example, in the Labor Party, you have many people making decisions collectively, and most things are always decided at committees with lots and lots of people. And so these decisions can always be changed depending on who's having a conversation with who, and the structure is a bit fluid as well. Accountability is also unclear. For a politician, whether they're accountable to the electorate, to the party, to your own branch, focal interest groups, certain communities, or their own supporters. And even when I talk about the party, that could mean many different groups as well. Legitimacy can also be very complex because if we think back to Julia Gillard, even though she has the legitimacy of who's our Prime Minister, in her case, the electorate never gave her the full legitimacy after the leadership spill. Performance criteria is also very fluid depending on who you're talking to. The constituencies might have a very different view to other stakeholders, and if you're a minister, again, it's very, very different. So after understanding the strategic thinking within whatever context we're talking about, that requires change. The next thing you need is the intellectual openness. To understand who your possible allies might be, the opposition, those who can be influenced to become your allies, this is effectively engaging with the networks of people, understanding which positions might align, where they diverge, And sometimes your traditional allies might not support you on a specific point because it might create risk for them. And some people who might be your opponents might quietly support you if you speak to them with respect. And this demands intellectual openness to other people's perspectives. But of course, when you have so many different perspectives, you can't please everybody as well. So critical thinking follows. This is to work out what you need to take into consideration, what might be irrelevant or distracting, what trades-off are acceptable, and more importantly, which battles are actually worth fighting for, which ones can wait, and it's all a balancing act. And so that leads me to the final aspect, which is political judgment. This is probably by far the most important subset of skills that politicians talked about, because it's the skills that brings literally everything together. It helps you assess situations and also people, when timing matters, when the tone matters, what and where you say it matters as much as when and how you say it as well. So just for example, in internal ballots for party positions, for example, I would make many calls. Some people would say yes to support me, but ends up voting for somebody else. And not necessarily because they're bad people, but because something's changed, or feels safer, or someone else made a more persuasive argument. Or people might say maybe, but ends up actually voting for you anyway. And in those conversations, you get a sense of what people are leaning and what people are actually saying. And that's political judgment on people, judging how much you can trust what they're telling you. There's also a cultural component for me as well, because in my own culture, you learn to do things to not embarrass people. So when I was doing this the first time, I didn't have much experience in getting a straight up no from people. So I got really upset. I thought people were rude, but over time, I came to really appreciate those who say no up front, and even better if they tell me why. Some reasons might be very harsh, but they're important. I've also found that being able to accept no means people would be more happy to be frank with you as well, because you won't react badly. And all this helped me learn political judgment on who I can rely on, who's clear, who might shift, those who will never listen. It helps me to develop the clarity and resilience and understand where the opportunities and risks are. Then we've got the second category of political skills, which are communication skills. So people might think they know what communication skills are, but communication skills in politics is quite unique. As one former minister puts it, persuasion is the name of the game. This could mean getting people to do things they might not particularly motivated to do, getting people to understand that this course of action is going to be more productive than another, persuading them that something is doable at all, which they think might be impossible, and inspiring them to try. And communication skills come in two parts as well. You've got your mass communication, what the public generally sees, that's the campaigning, the media, the public speech. And then the second part is the private communication. For me, developing the mass communication has quite been a journey as well. I used to be really, really shy. Not just an introvert, but I used to be really shy. You probably wouldn't pick it up now, but I used to blush when I had to express my own opinions to even a small group of people. When I had to speak at my high school assembly, I was physically trembling. I remember thinking after high school, after year 12, I'm really determined to change that. So at university, I put myself in situations where I had to do public speaking. So helping university clubs promote events, speaking at lectures, facing crowds. And so with practice, I became better. And that's why not having communication skills initially is not really a barrier to becoming a politician. You just need to want to learn this skill. However, mass communication is probably not the most important form of communication for politicians, even though people assume it is, because that's the skill they can see. And it is actually the private communications that happen every day for politicians. Arguably, this is probably the form of communication that gets more work done. It includes how to frame messages to the person you're speaking to, how you might need to persuade them to support something that you really want. All these private conversations, quiet negotiations, one-on-one talks, building alliances, those matter just as much, if not more, than the grand speeches. Now, as I mentioned, negotiation happens every day in politics. So I will also mention that when talking about political skills, I take quite a neutral approach to this, because what I personally believe is progress and success is probably not shared by people like Pauline Hanson. So when you have people with very, very different values, the only way to find common ground is through negotiation. And then we've got the third category of skills, which are the social acuity skills. The skills to build trust with people. And that includes self-awareness, relating to others, and relating to the collective. Self-awareness means being aware of who you come across, the voice, what your voice says, what your silence says, your body language, your presence. Because people perceive what they perceive, regardless of your intention. If you appear tired, disengaged, distracted, even when you're not, people can see that as a lack of trust. People will read those signals. I remember years ago, I was running an event with multicultural communities, and it was attended by very diverse group of people. People from departments, we had researchers, we had community activists, and community members as well. And there were speakers, and in the audience was a really vocal person who asked a really pointed question to the speakers. I remember back then I tensed up. I was worried whether or not the speakers might get upset. I was worried what other people in the room might feel and whether or not they would feel discomfort. The speakers handled the questions really well. But after the event, I checked in on both the speakers and also other people in the room. Some people said the really vocal person was really great, very passionate. It was really good to hear that. But others, especially those from my own community, felt it was too confrontational. At that point, I realized something quite powerful. There's a huge difference between how, as an Australian, might perceive that interaction as opposed to someone of my own heritage. And after that realization, I started testing that skill at various events, roundtables, discussions. Sometimes I would be a bit more pointed, sometimes less so, but always observing how people might react to me, but always adjusting. And sometimes I'll get it wrong, sometimes I'll get it right. But through that journey, I've learned what is acceptable pointedness, what is too direct and therefore alienating. That built my own awareness of how people might perceive me, without necessarily changing who I am, but shaping who I show up. And then there's also relating to others, which is about empathy and listening, and hearing the words, hearing beyond the words. In politics, a lot of people talk, but very few people listen. And even fewer listen with intent to understand, rather than an intent to respond. When you listen deeply, you understand their fears, their hopes, their values. And when you truly understand, it makes every argument more resonating and leadership also more grounded as well. I remember at one round table, we were discussing a particular topic, and a person with limited English ability said yes to a question. But everything after that, that yes pointed to a no. And so I ended up having to ask the question in another way. The person explained it in a much better way. And it was one incident where listening and really hearing what people were saying really made a difference. And now finally, relating to collective means being able to sense the mood, the vibe of the room, or the vibe of an electorate or an issue. It's almost intuitive, but it's usually learnt through practice. through campaigning, through community events, knocking on doors, having small conversations at street stalls. And usually over many conversations, patterns start to emerge and you get a sense of what people are feeling before they actually say it. And that matters in politics. At the last federal election campaign, I remember campaigning for different candidates, hours on the door knocking, handing out how to vote at pre-poll. Yes, there were people who disliked policies, there were criticisms, but there were no hatred towards the government. And that feeling was really powerful because it pointed to a possible return of a Labor government. And we now all know the end result, Labor achieving the largest caucus since Federation. But being on the ground to feel the vibe is a form of political skills as well. And so when I look back on my journey from community advocacy to leadership, what really stands out most is not the titles or the positions, but the political skills I learned along the way, and sometimes quite painfully. Too often we expect people, especially those from underrepresented communities, step into leadership without the preparation that others might receive through informal networks, privileges, or proximity to power. We just tell them to be confident, to be strategic and to speak up, but we really rarely tell them or show them how that is done. Making political skills explicit, I believe, fills the gap. They turn good intentions into effective actions. They help people read the room, sense the timing, build coalitions, find the language that resonates with different people and beyond the immediate circles as well. And at Per Capita, being a centre-left think tank, I see political skills are crucial to help bring others along a journey, sometimes a very, very long one. But when it's done well, it transforms frustration into a plan and advocacy into action as well. I believe that for Australia to become a truly inclusive democracy, more people need to access the learning of political skills to ensure that the next generation, especially those who've never seen themselves reflected in power, to enter political spaces not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as leaders ready to shape that. And that's the promise of political skills. They're not just a tool for success, it's an instrument for justice as well. And when we learn them and when we share them and use them well, they don't just change individuals, they change what's possible for us all. Thank you. Thank you. Q&A now. So do we have any questions? We've got a microphone over there as well. Oh, we've got...
Thanks very much, that was fantastic. The question around the intellectual openness that you spoke about, having it as a skill is one thing, but how do you foster that in an environment that kind of seems increasingly polarised or split and diverse in that way, where that openness might not be there? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one because I think this is where I think the private communication is really important. Rather than having everything done on social media or a big room full of people, when you have conversations with people who might be different to you, if you're having just a conversation at home or at different spaces, it's much easier to shift them because they don't feel like they're exposed. And so sometimes it's hard to get people to have those intimate discussions because they're so close, right? And it also requires people to listen as well. But I do feel like there needs to be a lot more of this engagement and not just cancel someone because they're from a different party or they're supporting, this person you don't like. Yep. Oh.
Okay. Hi, thank you for that. That was great. I really like what you were talking about with developing people's political skills. I know the Grattan Institute runs a policy advocacy course. Is Per Capita thinking about getting into the kind of training people or teaching how to develop those political skills? Is that something Per Capita's going to look at?
Potentially, yes. Yeah. Yep. Oh, and then.
Thank you very much. Wesa, lovely talk, and I was thinking that part of the real problem is institutional, and certainly in Victoria, a major barrier to having a wider range of people from different cultural backgrounds is in fact the way we do pre-selections and the control of the factions over the party. And this means that you've got to get through the faction first before you can go to the party. In New South Wales, they don't have a POSC, and they have ordinary members voting their pre-selections. And they have come up with a much better suite of people from different communities. And any nation today, ostensibly originally, European Christians can have a member of parliament and now a treasurer whose given name is Jihad, is doing bloody well. So I feel that one of the things we've got to campaign for is to break the factions' institutional control over pre-selections. We're seeing in Melbourne a candidate who came from the outside. She's in a faction now, but she did not come up through the pipeline. She did not come up through Young Labor and the party. She's been out in the community doing a whole host of things. She never went to university. And she's giving us an object lesson every day in how to be a good MP, in the way she's connecting with the community and the way she talks to people. And she never talks at them. She's always asked them, what do you want? What's bothering you? She never engaged with them on the campaign, are you going to vote Green again? Or why don't you vote Green? Never once mentioned Adam Bad. But what she's showing is the authenticity, the warmth, the connection with people and the respect for them that actually wins trust. And she's, I think, someone who's an exemplar now. And she's done an interview for Social Democratic, which encapsulates it and be very good for training.
Yeah, so obviously, like I mentioned, there's a lot more systemic issues that needs to be dealt with as well. And in terms of, you know, the member for Melbourne, she's absolutely lovely. And I think also, like what I mentioned about social equity skills, like the need to actually build trust and be able to connect with people is really, really important. Yeah.
I've got a second question.
Quick one.
The big crisis in liberal democracies now around the world, whether it's US, UK, Germany, France, is the division between the educated and the uneducated. And that's where the trust, so if you're talking about leaders, they're the educated talking to everyone else. And that's where liberal democracies have failed. That's why we've got a rise in populism, because they feel betrayed. They've not participated in the wealth share from neoliberalism. They've been left behind. And the terrific problems the British Labour Party has in communicating with people, because although this particular government is better than previous ones, essentially it's a clique of people who went to Oxford together to do politics, economics and philosophy. Now, that class division that's emerged, and it's why the Democrats did so badly in the last election. Trump's people are talking to the people who don't want to be patronised by educated people. Like
So you'd be
this is the big trouble. This is, sorry.
Yeah, so you'll be happy to see our the weigh-in report released very soon.
I'm going to extend that a little by saying that our education system is producing those divisions.
Yes, always has.
And we have. It is producing and continues to produce serious divisions in our country, and we have to do something radically about that. Our public education system needs.
I would disagree. I think the public education
Yeah, so
system
I
in
think-
Victoria is doing very well.
I think the systemic issue definitely needs to be addressed. As I said, the first group of people who gets in will probably need a lot more political skills to actually bring people together. Melba?
My empowerment as a migrant here came from the Philippines, parliament in the streets. Okay, so we have so many people like me around who have voices in leadership that that cannot be heard still, because we're so institutionalized. Everything is so established. I had to deal with the ALP in the 90s. I became just a token, when they wanted, I better stand up, when they wanted me to bring people from culturally diverse backgrounds, I would be the first one to be run, by one of my friendly ministers, and I'll bring the people. But nothing really happened. We were always just used as tokens.
Yep.
It took a lot out of me and so many of my friends to actually be at a space where we can see some of our people getting into, local government committees, like the equity, different committees of the local government, because, we introduced, and I particularly pioneered, the development of a leadership course for grassroots people, particularly women. And we were able to train 2,000 people through the help of friendly local government councils. Okay? I would have wanted that to be a program all throughout, because that's what we need, at the local level, community leadership that is ongoing, not just once off. But up to now, I presented that to the Labour government as well, when I think during the time of Fiona Richardson didn't get anywhere. Okay? But I agree with everything that you said. Most of Wesa's experiences have been, through the institutions, through the established networks. But I'd like Per Capita to look into the non-establishment groups and structures. They are everywhere, and we still have a lot of connections. We even set up women's friendship circles and women's friendship cafes. These are the women who are so isolated. They may be elderly, victims of family violence, but deep inside them, they're bringing different and diverse types of leadership. I wish research, can be helpful in actually bringing that out. Because the kind of leadership, the ones of Julie Gillard and the others, those are established through established structures. They didn't have to work hard for that. It's all there.
Oh, I'd probably argue that they did work hard for it, but in a probably but probably in a different way. But I think those are really important conversations as well, because what I'm talking about is the skills that how politicians actually become politicians, and this is what they've told me, right? But at the same time, knowing that there's a lot more work that's been done, there's a lot more leadership in the community, we actually need to educate some of these people about, what political skills are actually about, and bring them in. And I think that's what we need to do more of as well, is to how do we bring more of them in and help them stay there, because I see a lot of people from different cultural backgrounds might stay for 2 years and then they might leave because they don't understand how it works. And as you said, it's institutionalized. And so in order to change that, you need to know what you're changing. And until we get there, things will continue to happen the way they are until we have a cohort of people who is able to get in and make those changes happen.
One question
Yeah.
goes back to towards the beginning of your talk, you were wondering, you were talking about politicians not understanding or not having a good map of where their accountabilities lay. And I'm interested in both why you think it's difficult to understand and what the impact of not understanding it or understanding it is.
So it's more the transparency is unclear because they get pre-selected by their own party. And so arguably the party will have some, say as to how they should operate. And they're also obviously elected by their own electorate as well, and that's a big one. And so therefore they should have accountability to the whole of electorate, but the electorate is also not one group of people. So you've got different groups of people. You might have different interest groups. And so some people might choose, for example, to say, well, I'm going to really just support the people who elected me, not the people who didn't elect me, which, when you think about it, probably shouldn't happen because when you're elected, you should be serving everybody. But that's what I mean about being unclear, because each politician might have a different choice as to who they're actually listening to. And the good politicians obviously listen to everybody. And even the people who don't elect them, they will still serve them, hopefully. But like I said, it can be unclear depending on who the politician is and how they might decide to choose which group of constituencies they're going to be accountable to. Other questions?
Yeah, hi, I'm Matthew Schultz. I work at the Institute of Community Directors. Really interested in hearing what you've got to say. One question is around existing training. There is existing training for aspiring politicians, such as Pathways to Politics. Our organisation ran something for local council called Women Leading Locally. There's Australian Progress, there's other organisations. So what do you reckon those programs are currently missing, and what do you think, is an area that could be developed further? And just a sub part of that is we're talking about politicians, but for a lot of not-for-profits, they need to engage with politicians anyway, not necessarily running for office. Is this kind of the areas that you're looking at too?
Great question. So I was one of the alums of Pathways to Politics, and I'm now on the advisory group as well. So one of the things that I did find through my research is political judgment is the skill that you can only develop in politics. So the others with mass communication, obviously you can build that in other ways. Communication, you can build that other ways. Intellectual skills, you can build that other ways. But it's the political judgment, because unless you actually put yourself in those experiences, you don't really get a sense of how to do it. And in terms of not just politicians, the activists, the policymakers, and that's probably something that I want to help those people to develop these skills so that when they engage politicians, they know how to actually influence with impact.
If you're going to teach me about politics here, what do you know about politics elsewhere? In Australians in general, I am generalising of course, so I apologise in advance, know very little about the politics of the people I've come from. So learning is an exchange. I'm not a blank page and you just write on me. You have to know something about the rest of the world. You don't have to be a specialist, but you have to have some idea. And when our children go to school and are not taught politics, and they're not taught politics, then we keep producing the same thing. And so I of course have the obligation of learning about politics in Australia because I've come to Australia. But you need to learn something about politics in the rest of the world. And we've had this conversation before, and it's not just the Philippines.
Yeah.
You know, it's everywhere. So, what is internationalism? Where is a width of politics? Where is comparison? What do we bounce what you're trying to teach me from, with? So, we're just very self-complacent here about what we know. We know what we see on television. We see a couple of countries, 3 maybe. Or some disaster brings us news of a place, but we don't actually know anything about the base. So without that comparative ability, possibility, we're always going to be behind.
That's a very, very good question. So
And
when
it's not a question. I don't ask many questions.
but I would like to respond to something because I think
I share my
because I think so when I talk about the political context, that's what it is. So every country will have a very different political context. So my research was only in Australia, but if you take, for example, Europe, there's so many countries there, and each political context will have a different way of, there will be different ways in which you can influence. The way you might influence a France parliament would be completely different to what we would do here. And even if you go to America right now, the way you would influence American politics will be very different from here. And one of the things I did talk about is, if you think about when America tries to import certain campaigns to Australia, it doesn't work because they don't understand the Australian context. And that's what I mean when it comes to context. And it's very important to actually know the actual context you're actually working in before you start to influence.
I'm going to jump in for a question. Do you have any examples of really great conversations you've had with people where you've influenced someone, and what was the story behind that, and how did you get to that point of influencing them?
Yeah, so I've had experiences where I did get, for example, motions through state conference. So the process I did take was, I had the idea, but I ended up speaking to a lot of people first. So politicians, unions, anyone I can speak to that could potentially, that I need to get support from, and had to get through, talk to a lot of people, basically. And through that process, I also had to adjust a few things within what I was asking for, just to making sure that I can keep the essence of what I wanted to ask, as opposed to some of the details that could be challenged. And so it did end up getting supported, but it was a long process.
Great, thanks.
You haven't mentioned bag of money.
No oldie bags.
That's how it works.
No paper bags.
Do you have time for...
We'll make this 1 and 2. Yeah.
Just mates now.
Yes, look, congratulations on your work and your presentation here today. I'm probably the only former parliamentarian in this room at the moment, and I do identify with a lot of the findings that you've made. One thing that you haven't commented on, but you may have looked at, is the role of politicians or parliamentarians in engaging people in the development of policy and dealing with policy problems. So we've got a view about what politicians can do to encourage participation, which to my mind is one of the important factors that we must use a lot in order to save democracy.
Yeah. So in terms of how the skills is structured, it's probably included in many different aspects of the skills, including, for example, the private communication skills, where they actually bring in ideas, and the intellectual openness, like having all these different perspectives and ideas, and then after that, using the critical thinking skills to actually sort them through as well, and then finally come up with a position. But we should be encouraging more people to do that, absolutely. And I think the ones who can really build trust are the ones who actually do that, who go out and talk to people and be able to engage in that way. We'll have a final question.
Yeah. I've been involved in many campaigns over the last 3 years, and door knocking and summaries of that. And what I found very often was a genuine attitude towards politicians in general, not whether they come from Labour Party, whether they come from Greens. And a lot of the answers you get is that it doesn't really matter which politician you vote for, they're all the same. Now, I don't know whether that's just anecdotal or whether that's actually a tendency. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about that and how that affects the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so the interesting thing, not directly about that because the research didn't really look into it, but when I was doing the research on it, the people actually talk about the lack of training to politicians, and it was partly, because there's a lot of distrust with politicians, and therefore it's harder to actually provide training to politicians. So it's often seen as, you know, we're helping them to become better spin masters, or, you know, they should already know how they should be performing, and therefore they shouldn't need any training. So there's also that as well when it comes to training of politicians and the skills development of politicians as well. And partly the reason why we don't have a lot of support for politicians to develop certain skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Wesa, for that insightful presentation. I know the Per Capita staff team are very excited to have you on board and excited about where we will go and what we will do under your leadership. So we're very much looking forward to seeing where Per Capita will go in the next few years. Indeed, thank you. Next month is our last John Cain lunch for the year. That will be November 19th. We will be hearing from Professor Philip Mendes from Monash University on his new book, From Resistance to Reform, Case Studies of Long-Term Social Justice Advocacy in Australia. If you would like to stay updated with Per Capita events and research, the best way to do that is to subscribe to our email newsletter. If you haven't already, you can visit our website and there's a link to subscribe in the top right-hand corner. Thank you very much for coming today.